I think we'll be extraordinarily lucky if we don't have a global war in the next century. It seems strange to ask about World War III today. Here we are commemorating the First World War, and it's now been some 70 years since the end of World War II. It's easy to forget that there was no world war for the whole of the 19th century. One could perhaps talk about the Napoleonic Wars as a world war. After all, they were fought in North America and India, as well as in Europe. But for the whole of the 19th century, there was no global war. And then in 1914, one broke out. The biggest difference today is that people have forgotten that the capacity for huge destruction still exists. And that perhaps is the greatest threat, that when we think about confrontation with Russia, we forget about the thousands of nuclear weapons that the Russians and the Americans still have ready to fire on a hair trigger. We know little about Russia, but we know in America that senior officers were sacked for alcohol abuse and corrupt gambling practices just in the last couple of years, and that morale amongst the men and women who have to prepare every day to launch these missiles is at rock bottom. So it isn't so much a war by intent as accidental war in crisis.
And what about, you had mentioned nuclear weapons there, what about, we don't know much about North Korea's nuclear weapons, do we?
Well, we don't know much about North Korea, India, Pakistan, or indeed Israel. But the fact of the matter is that these countries have very small numbers. Now, these could kill hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people, but they don't pose a threat of global extinction, which the thousands of nuclear weapons still in the Russian-American arsenals do. And we comfort ourselves that everyone would be too sensible to use them. But sadly, people have not been too sensible when it came to the recent fiascos of Iraq, the long drawn-out loss in Afghanistan, and the current slow-moving train wreck in Ukraine. And there aren't a separate group of decision makers, as it were, kept to one side, who somehow have a more or less sanctified view of nuclear weapons that would keep us safe from them. That it's the same people, the same institutions organising nuclear weapons as organise the rest of the military. And I think this should give people pause for thought. And right now there isn't any global system to control, let alone abolish these weapons. So it isn't so much saying, well, who would start the war, but one can be sure that if such a war broke out, as indeed the great Albert Einstein said, that you don't know quite what would happen in World War III, but you can be sure that World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones, because we'd be back in the caves. Well, of course, everyone said, could you abolish these weapons? And the short answer is yes, it's not rocket science. We have a project, scrapweapons.com, which is all about scrapping all the weapons in the world. And if you look at how the treaties that Reagan and Thatcher and Gorbachev signed on not just nuclear weapons, but covering aircraft and tanks, if you look at those provisions, there's the how-to. It's an awful lot simpler than trying to control global warming, which we think we can do, to bean count the weapons and to check them. And these agreements were made to stick in a world without Google Maps and without drones that cost £10,000. In the modern world of observation, to verify what is going on with another country's armaments is much, much simpler. So then it comes to political will. And that, of course, is in a sense chicken and egg. And I think what we do with the Scrap Weapons Project is to say, listen, here is how to do it. We can get rid of these weapons. It is practical. We know how to do it. We've done it before. The technology is there. So don't tell us it's not practical. Mm-hmm. And indeed, one of the ironies of the Iraq inspection regime was that it worked. There were no weapons. The inspectors got it right. the UN system of inspection in Iraq succeeded. And if we talk to ambassadors and say, well, if you tell us it isn't possible to have a disarmed world, if you talk to officials from China or Russia or or United States or Britain, they say it isn't possible. And you say, well, perhaps you could sign up to the regime we had for Iraq. And they say, oh, we don't want anything that tough. Almost without blushing. Because, of course, that regime was highly intrusive, was effective, and actually now the technology is, another 10, 15 years on in terms of checking it. So to say that we couldn't have disarmament is utter nonsense. It is practical, and once we realize it's practical, then it becomes easier, I think, to start to create the political will. We're talking about the things that really go bang, and radiological weapons and dirty bombs, chemical weapons, biological weapons are all very serious problems. But to be frank, none of them destroy property things. These weapons destroy or hurt people, but they leave buildings and everything else intact. So from a military perspective, they really aren't that perspective, desirable. Again, without wanting to underestimate them, biological and chemical weapons are truly horrific if they get to you, weapons like VX. But they are actually quite hard to manufacture, quite hard to handle safely, quite vulnerable to temperatures being high or low. And when it comes to biological weapons, yes, there are horrors such as anthrax, which have very high lethality. But for most of the rest, to be frank, if you're a well-fed, healthy person from the north, from Europe, then what you've got is a public health problem. They really are lethal if you are poor and impoverished and vulnerable anyway, these sorts of replicated diseases. The Americans and the Russians each have several thousand nuclear weapons ready to go, ready to fire, at a few minutes to a few hours notice. Then they each have another 5,000 or 10,000 nuclear weapons in the back of the storeroom, ready to stick on a rocket if they need to, in reserve. And then you have to go down, and the Chinese, the French have a couple of hundred. The UK pretty much rents its from ones from America. There's no real independent UK force. It's the kind of the emperor's new clothes problem that no one wants to talk about in the Westminster Village. That Trident, it's an American system, and even Aldermaston is owned by American companies nowadays. You go below that, and you're looking at China, India, Israel, Pakistan, with perhaps a few dozen nuclear weapons each, which is not to say, after all, Japan surrendered partly as a result of 2 weapons. That one or 2 nuclear weapons can cause a huge amount of catastrophic damage and suffering, but it's a very different order of magnitude to having hundreds or thousands.
Can I ask you, when were they produced, and could more be produced in the future, or are they still being produced?
Yes, all the countries with nuclear weapons are engaged in building new ones. Sometimes they just say, well, they're just being refurbished, and nuclear weapons, unlike a bullet, which you can make in 1914 and put on the shelf and take it off the shelf and stick it in a rifle and fire it today, 100 years later. That isn't the case with nuclear weapons. They have sell-by date stamped on them, or bomb-by date stamped on nuclear weapons, because the radioactive material deteriorates, because the radiation attacks the plastic and other components, and they have to be continually refurbished. So they were first of all made in 1945. You then had a massive increase of production, so that there were perhaps 50,000 nuclear weapons in the world. So there were some 7,000 nuclear weapons just in West Germany during the Cold War, and nuclear weapons were made to be fired out of artillery guns, and there were thousands of these produced. particularly by the United States, had an affection for them. But now the numbers have come down to just maybe 10, 20,000 altogether.